He only wanted a quiet flight home. No drama, no spotlight, just a comfortable seat and a few hours of peace. Instead, a single request from a flight attendant turned into a national storm, forcing everyone to question just how far VIP status should go when weighed against basic respect. Hey squad, welcome back to the channel. Before we continue, please like this video and smash the subscribe button. Now, let's dive into one of the stories of grit, guts, and epic comebacks, a raging encounter that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Darius Cole could already feel the ache in his shoulders as he walked down Concourse B of Portwood International Airport. The overhead lights hummed with a monotonous drone, and the airport's polished floors reflected the figure of a tired man who had given more energy than he had in the tank. He had just wrapped up a whirlwind weekend at a networking conference in Seattle, the kind of event where business cards flew like confetti and the after-hours talks were filled with jargon and polite handshakes. Now Darius was simply thinking about home, the routine comfort of his own bed, the chatter of his 7-year-old twins, and the aroma of his wife's fresh banana bread lingering in the kitchen. His flight back to St. Louis was scheduled for 5:15 p.m., and for once, he had decided to treat himself to a VIP seat, an upgrade he rarely indulged in. At 6'3" with a linebacker's frame, Darius always found airplane seats painfully cramped, so when he saw a discounted upgrade notification on his phone the night before, he thought, why not? After all, he deserved a little extra legroom. He rolled his modest black carry-on through the crowded terminal, pausing briefly at a bookstore to browse for something to read on the flight. He picked up a novel about a small-town romance, completely out of character for him, and debated if it might be a nice change from the corporate emails he'd been poring over for weeks. Ultimately, he decided against it, opting instead for a sports magazine highlighting an up-and-coming college basketball star, a reminder of the life Darius had once dreamt of before an ACL tear ended his own athletic aspirations. Tucking the magazine under his arm, he made his way toward Gate C-19. The gate area was already bustling with travelers, families corralling toddlers, business people on conference calls, and a steady line of folks in sweatshirts balancing fast food bags. The overhead monitor read, Flight 3021 to St. Louis on time, boarding in 20 minutes. Darius found a seat in the corner, put his backpack on his lap, and scrolled through his phone. A few text messages from co-workers congratulated him on the talk he'd given at the conference. One even attached a selfie of them side by side, capturing Darius's grin, tired but triumphant. It was a good conference, he murmured to himself. He had pitched a bold idea about bridging technology gaps in underfunded communities, and the reception had been overwhelming. Several investors had shown interest, a surreal experience for a man who'd come from a small neighborhood in Columbus, Ohio, where even basic computer labs in schools were a rarity. Before long, a pleasant chime announced the start of boarding. As a VIP ticket holder, Darius belonged to the first group allowed onto the aircraft. He showed his digital pass to the gate agent, who flashed a polite smile. "Enjoy your flight, sir," the agent said, albeit somewhat mechanically. Darius stepped onto the jet bridge, the claustrophobic corridor that always made him feel oddly hopeful, like each trip was an adventure, even if just an ordinary flight home. The flight attendant at the plane's entrance greeted him with a nod, and he found his seat. 2A, a window seat in the front row with extra legroom and slightly wider cushions. He let out a small exhale of relief when he settled in, placing his backpack under the seat in front of him. This, he thought, was exactly what he needed. A comfortable ride and maybe a short nap. Passengers continued to board in a steady flow. First came a couple carrying a small child who kept slapping stickers onto the seat arms, then a businesswoman juggling 2 phones, and eventually a retired couple who were chatting about how airplane seats used to be bigger back in the day. Darius tried to drown out the noise by scanning an email from a nonprofit that wanted his insight on a local mentorship program. Just as he stifled a yawn, a flight attendant in a crisp navy blue uniform approached. Her name tag read, Mary Ann. She offered a tight smile, the polite but perfunctory kind Darius had grown accustomed to seeing in corporate environments. "Mr. Cole?" she asked, glancing at her clipboard. "We have a small request. One of our frequent flyers was placed toward the back by mistake, and he's asked if you'd be willing to switch seats with him." Darius looked up, his eyebrows arching in confusion. "Switch seats? Why?" She pursed her lips. He's part of our highest-tier loyalty program and was expecting an upgrade. Unfortunately, we overbooked VIP seats. We're asking if you'd be open to accommodating him." Darius gazed around. The seat next to him, 2B, was still empty, but the rest of the VIP rows appeared mostly full. Where would I go? She pointed at her clipboard. Row 28. The quiet laugh that left Darius's mouth came out more like a grunt. I paid for this seat, he said, maintaining a respectful tone, and I'd like to keep it. I have a long flight ahead, and sitting up here was a conscious choice. Marianne paused, as if recalculating her approach. I understand, sir. No worries. She gave him a nod, though her eyes revealed the slightest hint of tension. Darius shrugged it off, trying not to read too much into it. Maybe they just had to ask. He refocused on his phone, but in the back of his mind, he felt a seed of unease. No big deal, he told himself. They'll figure it out. A few minutes later, another flight attendant approached, this one older, with pinned-up hair that suggested a senior rank. Her tone was more direct. Mr. Cole, we really need your cooperation. We've got a frequent flyer in the back who's upset about not having his usual first-class experience. Are you sure you can't move? This time Darius frowned. I'm sure. With all respect, I've paid for this seat. Her expression hardened. Yes, we understand. But according to policy, if there's a conflict with an executive-tier passenger, we do try to accommodate them as best as we can. It's a courtesy we show to top loyalty members. Courtesy at my expense? He asked quietly, doing his best to keep his voice neutral. Look, I'm sorry, but I won't be moving. The flight attendant briefly pursed her lips and walked away without another word. Darius felt a slight tightness in his chest. He'd encountered subtle discrimination before, the kind that floats just beneath the surface. This might not have been about race. It could easily have been about money or brand loyalty or some corporate policy. But the undertone of it, the ease with which they assumed he would just comply, left a sour taste in his mouth. Several rows back, a few passengers had already noticed the exchange. Darius locked eyes briefly with a woman who gave him a sympathetic shrug. He tried to shrug back, as if to say, yeah, I don't get it either. As the last of the passengers boarded, Darius hoped that was the end of it. However, just as the doors were set to close, a stern-faced gentleman in a pristine gray suit strode up the aisle, accompanied by one of the flight crew. He paused at row 2, gazing at Darius with a hint of annoyance. Are you Mr. Cole? He asked. His name tag identified him as Rick Harmon, the in-flight manager. Darius nodded. That's me. I'm going to have to ask you to collect your belongings and move to row 28, he said, his tone as bland as if he were announcing the flight's cruising altitude. A wave of frustration swelled inside Darius, but he kept his composure. On what grounds? On the grounds that we have a passenger with top-tier VIP status who needs this seat, Harmon replied, crossing his arms. You'll be compensated with a complimentary meal voucher and travel credit for your inconvenience. A forced hush fell around them as some heads turned to watch. Darius felt an uncomfortable knot in his stomach. He was a paying customer who had done nothing wrong, and yet he was being told to move with zero negotiation or empathy. This isn't right, Darius finally said, not shouting, just stating a fact. I'm not moving. I paid for this seat, just like he could have. Why do I have to give it up because he claims to be more important? Harmon's eyes flickered. Sir, if you choose not to comply, you may be removed from the flight entirely. Do you want that? An audible gasp came from a few seats away. A young man with headphones around his neck muttered, You gotta be kidding. Darius stared at the manager, searching for any sign of decency. But all he saw was rigid adherence to a set of rules that did not favor the everyday passenger. Slowly, with an internal churn of anger and disbelief, he stood up and gathered his carry-on. All right, he said quietly, I'll move. But this is the last time I'll fly with your airline. Harmon didn't even blink. That is your choice, he said, turning away. A hollow silence followed as Darius walked the aisle. Row 3, row 4, row 10, each step feeling heavier. Passengers stared, some with pity, some with confusion, some with condemnation, though for whom, Darius couldn't be certain. He could almost hear their inner thoughts. What happened? Why are they making him move? Is it because he's... But no one spoke the obvious question out loud. By the time Darius reached row 28, he felt a bead of sweat trickle down his temple. He had a middle seat sandwiched between a fidgety teen tapping at a handheld gaming console and a grandparent reading large-print mystery novels. The overhead bin was already full, forcing Darius to jam his carry-on under the seat. Meanwhile, the VIP who took seat 2A slid into the row with a casual smile, giving Harmon a thumbs up. The flight attendants busied themselves with pre-flight checks, but Darius noticed how none of them would meet his eyes when they passed by. After the plane taxied and ascended, flight attendants began their routine. In row 28, they didn't even glance at Darius beyond handing him a small packet of pretzels. The contrast between the surly vibe in the back rows and the forced cheerfulness up front was jarring. At first, he tried to keep to himself. The teen on his right was still absorbed in his game, occasionally elbowing Darius. The older woman on his left dozed off, her head lolling onto his shoulder more than once. All the while, Darius replayed the event in his mind. He wondered if it was a combination of a broken system and an unspoken bias. Would they have moved me so easily if I weren't black? If I were older? If I were dressed differently? Or if I had made a louder fuss? He pulled out his phone to distract himself, switching it to airplane Wi-Fi. Immediately, social media notifications lit up. His friend, Christopher, had tagged him in a post. "They did my man Darius Cole dirty on Flight 3021. Darius's eyebrows rose. He clicked on the link. A short video showed him in row 2, conversing calmly with the flight attendant, and then with Rick Harmon. The angle was from across the aisle. Someone must have been filming discreetly. In the clip, Darius's voice was clear. "This isn't right. I'm not moving. I paid for this seat. Why do I have to give it up because he's more important?" Then the next part showed Harmon threatening removal from the flight if Darius refused. The clip ended with Darius grabbing his bag. His heart pounded as he read the comments. Justice. For all. Typical airline discrimination. He didn't raise his voice or anything. Skywatcher 89. A loyalty tier? More like an elitist system. This is messed up. Monty the Man. I've seen this happen before. If you're not part of their top rewards program, you don't matter. Melb. He deserves a full refund and apology. Period. An apology? Darius scoffed under his breath. They hadn't even offered him a real explanation, let alone an apology. The story was picking up steam. He noticed retweets in the thousands, mentions from small news outlets, and people asking for the name of the airline so they could boycott it. By the time the flight was halfway to St. Louis, Darius's phone was buzzing nonstop. Old classmates, co-workers, and even distant relatives had reached out. "Are you okay? Saw the video, man. That's messed up. We stand with you." But amidst the wave of support, there was also the usual negativity. People claiming he must have done something wrong, or that the airline was just following policy. "Policy for who?" he muttered under his breath. The elderly woman beside him stirred, glancing at his phone with curiosity. "I'm sorry, dear," she said softly, "but I couldn't help but notice. Are you the fellow people are talking about on social media?" Darius gave a polite smile, though he felt drained. "Looks like it." She clasped her hands. "I saw them move you. Didn't feel right. If you ask me, you should have that seat. You paid for it." He nodded, a wave of gratitude for her support. "Well, maybe next time. Thank you, though." As the plane descended, Darius let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He had no idea what kind of storm awaited him in the terminal. Part of him wanted to slip away unnoticed and pretend it never happened. Another part recognized he was in the midst of something bigger than his personal discomfort. A conversation about everyday prejudice, corporate greed, or both. The moment the wheels touched down, passengers began gathering their belongings. Darius remained seated, waiting for the crowd to thin out. He didn't want a second round of public spectacle. As he finally stood up to retrieve his bag, a man across the aisle with streaks of silver in his hair quietly said, "I got the whole thing on video if you need evidence." Darius paused, then nodded. "Thank you." The man handed him a small slip of paper with an email address. "I've seen too many folks get mistreated because they don't fit the profile the company likes. Let me know if you need it." Darius carefully placed the slip in his pocket, feeling a mix of gratitude and frustration. He recalled too many instances in his own life, restaurants, hotels, even conferences, where certain looks or assumptions had followed him. This time, though, there was direct proof. Exiting the plane, he passed the flight attendants who were stationed near the cockpit door, wearing that same forced cheeriness. None of them met his gaze. Rick Harmon, the manager, was nowhere to be seen. Outside the gate, a few other passengers lingered, exchanging contact information. Darius could sense something swirling in the air, an unspoken consensus that what had happened was not just an inconvenience, but a genuine injustice. After he moved through the concourse, ignoring the swarm of travelers rushing to their next gate, Darius found a seat near a charging station to gather himself. He plugged in his phone, which was near dead from the constant notifications. Another text from his friend, Christopher. "Local news reached out to me for your contact. They want to interview you about the flight." Darius closed his eyes, inhaling slowly. Interviews, social media, phone calls. This was not the quiet evening he had envisioned. When he opened them again, a part of him wanted to brush it off. Another part remembered the times he'd let small indignities slide, telling himself it wasn't worth the hassle. He decided in that moment that maybe it was worth the hassle. By the time Darius got home that evening, his phone had nearly crashed from the endless pings. Journalists requesting statements, hashtags forming around his name, friends tagging him in solidarity posts. He set his bag down in the entryway, kicked off his shoes, and was immediately greeted by a chorus of small voices. His twins, Lydia and Marcus, barreled toward him, arms flailing. "Daddy's home," Lydia squealed. "You promised to watch our new dance routine." He managed a tired smile as he knelt to hug them. "Sure thing, princess. Let me just say hi to Mom first." In the kitchen, his wife, Danielle, was ladling soup into bowls. The warm, savory aroma of chicken and dumplings surrounded them. She glanced at him with both relief and concern, taking in his weary posture and furrowed brow. "You look exhausted," she said gently, sliding a bowl across the countertop. "Something happened on the flight?" He chuckled dryly. "You could say that." They settled at the table, the twins momentarily occupied in the living room, and Darius recounted the story. Danielle's face hardened as he described the repeated requests to move and the final ultimatum. "That's unacceptable," she said, a slight tremor in her voice. "They can't just force you out of a seat you paid for? Did they even give you a real explanation?" "All they mentioned was a policy about high-tier loyalty members," he replied. "I guess the white passenger in the back was some big-shot frequent flyer, and that gave him the right to kick me out of 2A. She reached for his hand, her eyes brimming with indignation. "You can't let them get away with this." "I know," he said, exhaustion seeping into his tone. "But I need to think about how to handle it. Social media's already going wild. I don't want to feed the frenzy if there's a calmer way." Before Danielle could respond, the doorbell rang. Darius groaned, suspecting it might be a reporter. He peered through the front window, seeing a vaguely familiar face, one of the local journalists, waiting patiently, a small camera crew behind her. "Looks like the story beat me here," he muttered. "They must have found my address." Over the next week, the story blew up in ways Darius never anticipated. "Black man forced to switch VIP seat for white passenger. Airline under fire," read one headline. Talk show hosts and online commentators debated everything from systemic racism to corporate greed, some framing Darius as a symbol of everyday oppression, others claiming it was a misunderstanding. The airline, Tri-Coast Air, tried to do damage control. Their spokesperson initially released a statement saying, "We value all passengers and are investigating any potential misapplication of policy." But as more eyewitnesses came forward with photos, videos, and personal anecdotes of similar experiences, Tri-Coast Air found itself in the hot seat. A spate of prior incidents surfaced, painting a picture of a loyalty program that sometimes downgraded paying passengers in favor of wealthier, higher-status flyers. It was a PR nightmare, and Darius was the reluctant face of it. On day 3 after the incident, Darius's phone rang with an unknown number. Normally he'd ignore it, but given the circumstances, he answered. "Hello, Mr. Cole," a measured voice spoke. "This is Anita Maxwell, head of customer relations at Tri-Coast Air. I'd like to personally apologize for what transpired on your recent flight." He felt a surge of frustration. "Apologize? It's a bit late, isn't it?" She exhaled. "I understand. We realize our policy was misapplied and want to make things right. We're offering you a full refund, plus a $500 travel voucher." Darius closed his eyes, counting to 3. "Ms. Maxwell, do you think $500 is enough to compensate for the humiliation of being told I wasn't as important as another passenger in front of a plane full of people?" A brief silence followed. "We want to start by acknowledging the error," she said, "and we're also updating our internal training. This shouldn't have happened." He almost laughed. "No, it shouldn't have. But I'm not after your vouchers. I'm after an honest conversation about why you moved me in the first place." "We're scheduling a meeting next week with some of our executives," Maxwell replied, her voice faltering for the first time. If you're willing, we'd like you to attend. We truly value your perspective." Darius paused, weighing his options. His initial instinct was to refuse. Why should he help them fix a system that had just wronged him? But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that ignoring the problem would simply allow it to happen again. "All right," he finally said. "Let me know the details." Meanwhile, social media chatter had turned into full-blown activism. Hashtags like "Gosh, keep your seat" and "Dignity in the air" trended for days. People posted stories of airline discrimination, seat downgrade shenanigans, or just general frustration with how big companies prioritize profit over fairness. Late-night comedians cracked jokes at Tri-Coast Air's expense. A popular late-night host said, "Apparently, Tri-Coast's new motto is pay for VIP, but pray you keep it." The audience erupted in laughter, but the undertone was serious. Friends and acquaintances bombarded Darius with messages of support. Old college teammates reached out, even cousins he hadn't heard from in years. "Proud of you," one text read. "Finally, we're talking about the little humiliations that add up over time." At the same time, critics emerged. Trolls online questioned whether Darius had fabricated the story for attention, or if he'd been aggressive, prompting his removal. Yet the videos showed the opposite. Darius calmly standing his ground, politely but firmly. The conversation expanded beyond seats on a plane to how society grants privileges in subtle, everyday ways that can make people of color feel lesser. In the middle of this storm, Darius tried to keep his routine. He still took Lydia and Marcus to soccer practice, still tried to stay on top of email at his day job, still attended Zoom meetings for the community tech initiative he was spearheading. Life went on, just with 1,000 extra voices swirling around him. A week after the incident, Darius found himself in a sleek conference room on the 30th floor of Tri-Coast Air's corporate headquarters. The windows offered a panoramic view of the city, glinting skyscrapers framed by a crisp blue sky. But the tension inside the room was more stifling than a turbulent flight. Anita Maxwell was there, seated beside a stern-faced legal counsel. Across from them sat the VP of Operations, a PR executive who introduced herself as Lisa Gibbons, and another figure who looked vaguely familiar, Rick Harmon, the in-flight manager from that day, who had demanded Darius move. He avoided direct eye contact, keeping his gaze on the papers in front of him. "Mr. Cole," Lisa began, "I want to personally thank you for coming. We understand how difficult this must be." Darius folded his hands on the polished table. "I'm here to talk solutions. You want to fix your policy, right?" She cleared her throat. "Absolutely. First, though, I want to reiterate our apology. The seat reassignments that took place were based on a misinterpretation of guidelines. Our policy is not to override a paid seat unless there's a safety concern or an operational necessity, neither of which applied in your case." Darius tilted his head. Misinterpretation, or just a standard practice of giving more important people better service? Rick Harmon finally spoke, albeit quietly. "I followed the guidelines as I understood them. Top-tier loyalty often means if they request a seat, we try to accommodate. I was told that we needed to move you. I regret the way I handled it." "Regret?" Darius repeated, letting the word hang. "What does that look like in terms of action?" Lisa jumped in. "We're revising the loyalty tier policy. Moving forward, if a seat is purchased, VIP or otherwise, a loyalty member can't displace that passenger without mutual agreement. We're also implementing new training to ensure staff understand the correct protocol. We're serious about this." Anita Maxwell nodded. "We're also offering to make a public statement clarifying your innocence in this matter, acknowledging the wrongdoing on our end. We hope that will curb any speculation that you were in the wrong." Darius pressed his lips together, recalling the wave of online debates. "I appreciate that. But this is bigger than just me. People have been sharing stories online of being forced to move, sometimes for trivial reasons. Are you going to address that pattern?" Lisa pulled out a file. "We've had an internal audit of seat reassignments over the last 2 years. We found that indeed there were consistent issues, though it wasn't always about race, it often was about status. We're dismantling that approach." He could sense sincerity in her voice, but also a desperation to contain the scandal. "And what about Rick here?" Darius asked, turning to face the in-flight manager. Rick swallowed hard. I'll be placed on probation, pending completion of comprehensive training. If I fail to comply with the new policies, I lose my position." It was a sobering moment for Darius, witnessing how quickly the tide had turned for a manager who, just a week ago, held so much confidence in humiliating him. "If you're genuine about change," Darius said, "then you'll have to show it in more than just words. Your staff needs to see accountability at every level. Otherwise, this will happen again." Lisa nodded firmly. "We understand. We were hoping you might be open to participating in a follow-up discussion with some of our internal teams, HR, training, and customer relations, to share your perspective." He paused, thinking of the nights he'd spent reading comment after comment from strangers who resonated with his story. "We'll see," he said, not fully committing. "I'm not a token you can trot out to show how inclusive you are now." Anita opened her mouth, but no words came. Eventually, Lisa took the hint. "Of course. We respect that." True to their word, Tri-Coast Air released a detailed statement. They acknowledged fault, apologized directly to Darius, promised structural changes to their loyalty seating policies, and committed to training programs aimed at preventing such incidents in the future. While some skeptics doubted their sincerity, many recognized it as a step in the right direction. Darius, meanwhile, found himself on the receiving end of public attention. People praised his calm demeanor, calling him the man who stood his ground without raising his voice. Others used him as a rallying point for broader social issues: economic inequality, racial bias in customer service, corporate ethics. A local news station set up an interview. The anchor asked Darius to reflect on how quickly the entire event escalated. He replied, "I think people are tired of being pushed around by systems that value certain customers over others, especially when it goes against basic fairness." "But do you think race played a role?" the anchor pressed. He inhaled, choosing his words carefully. "I can't say for certain what was in their minds. But I do know that when you see a black man in a VIP seat, some people might assume he doesn't belong there. That assumption can lead to actions. Whether or not it was conscious, it was wrong." The clip went viral, stirring more dialogue. The airline's stock took a minor dip, but in a strange twist, some commentators praised Tri-Coast for acknowledging mistakes relatively quickly, unlike other corporations that drag their feet or deny wrongdoing altogether. By week's end, Darius received a letter in the mail on Tri-Coast Air stationery. It contained a formal apology, a check refunding the full price of his ticket, and a voucher for future flights. A sticky note was attached. "We hope to earn back your trust." He stared at the note before setting it aside, unsure if trust could be purchased so easily. The incident, though taxing, acted as a catalyst for something deeper in Darius's life. He'd always tried to help underrepresented communities gain access to technology and resources, but now he saw a broader mandate: to ensure fairness and visibility in every corner of society, be it an airplane seat or corporate hiring practices. One afternoon, as he scrolled through the flood of messages, he noticed a pattern. Many of them ended with phrases like, "Thank you for standing up for us," or, "Because of you, I found the courage to speak out about my experience." He realized that by refusing to fade quietly, he'd become a small symbol of resilience. Eventually, a grassroots advocacy group invited him to speak at a seminar on consumer rights. At first, Darius hesitated. Public speaking about technology was one thing. He could discuss coding camps and bridging the digital divide all day. But consumer rights? Systemic bias? He felt out of his depth. Still, he accepted. He told the story from start to finish in front of a modest audience of 50 people, recounting every detail: the quiet tension, the forced compliance, the viral aftermath. When he finished, there was a pause, then thunderous applause. Not because he'd said something revolutionary, but because he'd spoken a common truth with dignity. Afterwards, people came up to him sharing personal anecdotes about workplace discrimination, rude customers, or situations where they were forced to relinquish something they had rightfully earned. That evening, as he left the venue, his phone buzzed once again. This time it was an email from the flight attendant named Marianne, the first one who had politely asked him to move. The subject line, "I'm sorry." The email was lengthy. Marianne explained the pressure they face. "We have to keep frequent flyers happy. We get evaluated on their feedback. I wanted to say no to them, but our managers prioritize these customers so heavily, it felt like we had no choice." She continued, "I realize that doesn't make it right. I'm writing to apologize for my role in causing you distress and to acknowledge that you should have never been asked to move after paying for that seat." Darius stared at his screen, then replied, "Thank you for reaching out. I appreciate the apology. I know it's tough for you too. Let's hope the new policy changes make a real difference." After hitting send, He felt a sense of closure he hadn't anticipated. Months later, the dust settled. Tri-Coast Air rolled out a rebranded loyalty program that clearly stated, in bold letters, "No loyal customer shall displace another fare-paying passenger without mutual consent." Industry insiders noted that the policy revision was a direct result of Darius's story. Interview requests trickled off, replaced by daily life once more. Darius remained at the helm of his community tech initiative. He relished simpler pleasures, cheering at his kids' soccer games, trying new recipes with Danielle, and engaging in lively weekend barbecues with neighbors. One day, a letter arrived. It was from a college student who had started a social media campaign about airline fairness, citing Darius's experience as the spark. "Your story showed me how an ordinary individual can create a ripple effect," it read. "Thank you for making me believe we can speak out against small injustices. Sometimes that's where real change begins." Darius grinned, folding the letter into a box where he kept cherished tokens of gratitude and achievement. His eyes lingered on the seat number scrawled in pencil on a scrap of paper. 2A. That detail once represented humiliation and frustration. Now, it reminded him that any seat he chose to occupy, on a plane, in a conference room, or in life, was his to keep, if he earned it honestly. No one could simply strip that away. He had been forced from his VIP seat into a viral spotlight, but what happened next shocked everyone indeed. The incident ignited a larger movement of questioning complacency. In the end, Darius realized that confronting prejudice and corporate misconduct doesn't always require shouting. Sometimes a quiet refusal to budge, and then calmly sharing the experience, can be the loudest statement of them all.